The gymnasium doors flew open with a thunderous bang, echoing across the empty court like distant artillery. Andras Kovac flinched instinctively, his body remembering the percussion of mortar shells that had haunted him through the Russian steppes. But this wasn't the Eastern Front. The sound came from nothing more threatening than a metal door swinging wide in an American prisoner of war camp. Bright afternoon light flooded the wooden floor, catching dust motes that danced like snow in the beams. A dozen Hungarian prisoners stood frozen, unsure what to make of the cavernous space before them. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, the floor gleamed with polish, and at either end hung strange circular hoops with nets dangling below. Captain Reynolds, the American officer who had marched them here, tossed something orange and dimpled toward Andras. He caught it reflexively. A ball, perfectly round and textured. Nothing like the misshapen leather footballs they'd occasionally kicked around in training camps back home. "Basketball," Reynolds announced, his voice bouncing off the high walls. "You boys ever play?" The prisoners exchanged glances, none daring to speak. They had been captured only weeks before in Italy, marched into American custody with the certainty that labor camps or firing squads awaited. Instead, they found themselves in this strange wooden cathedral with a ball in their hands. What kind of captivity was this, where guards invited prisoners to play games? Had the Americans truly brought them here to engage in sport together? Or was this some elaborate psychological test? As Andras turned the ball in his hands, feeling its unfamiliar texture, he couldn't help but wonder, what other surprises would their captors have in store? The journey to this moment had begun months earlier on the battlefields of northern Italy. Andras and his comrades in the 22nd Hungarian Infantry had fought alongside German forces, pushed back relentlessly by the advancing Allied troops. Hungary's reluctant alliance with the Third Reich had placed these men in a war many barely understood, fighting for causes that grew more distant and abstract with each passing day. When American forces finally broke through their defensive line near Bologna, Andras and several hundred others found themselves surrounded, ammunition depleted, orders confused. Surrender came not with dramatic flourishes, but with the quiet relief of men too exhausted to continue. Their officers had prepared them for the worst. Americans take few prisoners, Lieutenant Sabo had warned during their last briefing. They shoot officers outright. The rest face starvation or forced labor. These warnings echoed propaganda broadcasts that described Americans as vengeful cowboys and gangsters, undisciplined soldiers who treated war as sport. As Andras raised his hands above his head that spring morning, he believed he might be seeing his last sunrise. The first shock came immediately. The American soldiers who processed them spoke firmly but without malice. No shots were fired. Officers were separated but not executed. Food, actual bread and canned meat, was distributed within hours. And the journey that followed, first to holding camps in Naples, then across the Atlantic, revealed one unexpected scene after another. The troop ship that carried them to America offered another contradiction. The Hungarian prisoners were given hammocks below deck, crowded but not inhumane. 3 meals appeared daily. Simple fare, but more consistent than anything they'd received in the final months of fighting. Most surprising were the casual interactions with the American guards. These men chewed gum, played cards during breaks, and spoke to prisoners without the rigid formality Hungarian soldiers expected from captors. Some even attempted broken phrases in German, trying to bridge the language gap with prisoners who knew no English. Andras, who had learned some German during officer training, found himself reluctantly translating. "They want to know if anyone is sick or needs medicine," he told his suspicious comrades. The notion that captors would concern themselves with the health of prisoners seemed absurd, yet medics appeared daily, checking for fevers and infections. When land finally appeared on the horizon, the coast of Virginia, the prisoners crowded the railings. America had existed for them only as an abstract enemy, a distant land of skyscrapers and movie stars, gangsters and cowboys. Now they would see it with their own eyes. What awaited them was neither the gleaming futuristic metropolis nor the lawless frontier their propaganda had described. Instead, they saw endless docks bustling with activity, cranes swinging enormous crates onto ships, and workers moving with purpose rather than panic. The scale alone was disorienting. Back home, bombing had reduced most ports to rubble. Here, commerce continued as if war were a distant concern rather than an existential threat. Their final destination proved equally surprising. A camp set in the rolling farmland of Kentucky, surrounded by fields of corn and tobacco rather than barren wasteland. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, clean and solidly built. A mess hall promised regular meals. Even the barbed wire seemed almost apologetic, a formality rather than a serious barrier. What would happen within these fences? What strange new shocks awaited men who had expected brutality but found something entirely different? The answer would come soon enough, on a court of polished wood, with a dimpled orange ball passing from hand to hand. That first afternoon in the gymnasium remained etched in András's memory like a fever dream. The Hungarian prisoners stood awkwardly at one end of the court, the unfamiliar ball passing between them with clumsy uncertainty. Captain Reynolds and 3 other guards demonstrated the basics, dribbling the ball with one hand, passing it chest-high to teammates, shooting it through the elevated hoop. The prisoners watched with a mixture of confusion and wariness. Was this some elaborate test, a form of humiliation, or simply a game their captors enjoyed? None could quite believe the situation was as straightforward as it appeared. In basketball, Reynolds explained through a German-speaking private who translated haltingly, you cannot run with the ball. You must bounce it, like this. He demonstrated a dribble, the ball's rhythmic percussion echoing through the gymnasium. The prisoners exchanged skeptical glances. This strange bouncing game seemed purposeless, even childish. Yet they followed instructions, mimicking the movements with the self-consciousness of men under observation. András found the bouncing oddly satisfying, the ball returning to his hand with predictable fidelity. When he attempted his first shot at the basket, the ball sailed wide, not even grazing the backboard. The American guards laughed, not mockingly, but with the good-natured amusement of teachers watching novices. "You'll get it," Reynolds called, retrieving the ball. "Took me weeks when I started playing in high school." This casual encouragement, this assumption that prisoners would have time to improve at a game, contradicted everything András had expected from captivity. In Hungarian military training, failure earned punishment. Here, it merely prompted patience. The most unnerving moment came when Reynolds divided them into teams, not prisoners versus guards as they'd assumed would happen, but mixed teams, with Americans and Hungarians playing alongside each other. Suddenly, András found himself sharing a team with Private Miller, a freckled soldier from Iowa who had, until recently, been his enemy. Miller slapped him on the back after a successful pass, a gesture so casually friendly that András nearly stumbled in shock. The game itself was chaotic, marked by misunderstandings, language barriers, and frequent stops to explain rules. Yet something shifted during those 60 minutes. The boundaries between captor and captive blurred, replaced temporarily by the simpler divisions of teammate and opponent. When Sergeant Feher managed the first successful basket for the prisoners, scoring 2 points with a lucky shot, both Hungarians and Americans cheered. The moment hung suspended, a shared celebration that transcended the wider conflict that had brought them together. Afterward, as they filed back to the barracks, sweaty and unexpectedly energized, Zoltán Nagy, a baker from Budapest before the war, whispered what many were thinking. If they treat prisoners like teammates, what does this say about everything we were told? That night, the barracks buzzed with subdued conversation. Men who had remained stoically silent through capture and transport now found themselves debating the significance of an afternoon spent playing a bouncing ball game with their guards. Some remained suspicious, suggesting it was merely a propaganda exercise. "They'll photograph us playing and use it to show how well they treat prisoners," argued Corporal Varga, a committed party member. Others saw it as a meaningless diversion, a way to prevent boredom and maintain order. But a few, András among them, sensed something deeper. The Americans could have left them locked in barracks. They could have assigned back-breaking labor. Instead, they had shared their recreation, their enthusiasm, their game. "My cousin fought on the Eastern Front," murmured Ferenc Lakatos, a former factory worker from Debrecen. "Those who surrendered to the Russians never came back. We expected the Americans to be the same." He paused, the silence heavy with unspoken comparisons. "Instead, they teach us their games." The implication hung in the air.
If they had been so wrong about this, what else had they misunderstood? As the men settled onto their bunks, the sound of the basketball echoed in their memories, a rhythmic counterpoint to the certainties they had carried into battle. Outside, the Kentucky night wrapped around the camp, peaceful and vast, hiding secrets none of them could yet imagine. The second week brought another surprise: regulation matches scheduled every Thursday afternoon.
This wasn't a one-time novelty, but a recurring event, marked on the camp's activity board alongside work details and mealtimes. Hungarian prisoners who could barely explain the rules to newcomers now found themselves practicing in their spare time, improvising with wadded socks when balls weren't available. The guards brought magazines showing professional basketball teams, the Boston Celtics, the New York Knicks, men in short uniforms leaping impossibly high toward baskets. These images circulated through the barracks, studied like military intelligence, sparking debates about technique and strategy. What astonished the prisoners most wasn't the game itself, but the cultural space it occupied. For Americans, basketball was everywhere, played in schools, featured in newspapers, discussed over meals. Captain Reynolds explained that thousands of gymnasiums like theirs dotted the American landscape, from small-town high schools to prestigious universities.
The country had entire leagues dedicated to this bouncing game, with radio broadcasts following championship matches. This revealed an America few had imagined, a nation that built temples to recreation alongside its factories and military bases. "In my village," said Corporal Kovacs, a farmer's son from the Hungarian plains, "we had one football for the entire school. Here, they have balls to spare for enemy prisoners." The contrast was undeniable. Hungary, struggling through years of war and privation, had little resources for sport beyond basic physical training. America, even while fighting a global conflict, maintained its basketball courts and baseball diamonds, its swimming pools and tennis courts. Recreation wasn't a luxury, but a fundamental part of life, preserved even amid worldwide chaos. The gymnasium itself told this story.
Polished floors, electric lighting, glass backboards. These weren't improvised or temporary facilities, but permanent structures built with care and precision. For men who had spent years watching Europe's infrastructure crumble under bombs and neglect, this well-maintained sports facility represented something almost unimaginable. A society wealthy enough to create and maintain such spaces, even for the lowest members of its hierarchy, prisoners of war. What kind of nation produced such abundance? What would it mean to face such a power on the battlefield? These questions lingered, unspoken but persistent, as the prisoners practiced their dribbling on the sunlit court. During one particularly competitive game, Zoltan took an accidental elbow to the face from Private Collins, an American guard. Blood streamed from his nose, spattering the polished floor. The game halted immediately. What followed surprised everyone. Collins helped Zoltan to the sidelines, apologizing profusely. The camp medic arrived within minutes, examining the injury with the same care he might show to an American soldier. Ice was produced, painkillers offered. This treatment, immediate, professional, apologetic, stood in stark contrast to the battlefield medicine most had experienced. Andrus remembered a Hungarian sergeant who had beaten a private for complaining about an infected foot wound. "Pain is weakness," the sergeant had shouted. Here, pain was simply something to be treated, regardless of who suffered it. As the games continued through summer into fall, the players developed unexpected connections. Language barriers remained, but a new vocabulary emerged. Basketball terms became common ground. Dribble, pass, foul, defense. These words bridged Hungarian and English, creating a shared lexicon. Names replaced prisoner numbers. Guards called Andrus by his first name rather than Prisoner 17 or Hungarian. This simple human recognition, so at odds with military protocol, shifted something fundamental in the relationship. How could you maintain pure hatred for an enemy who remembered your name, who complimented your improving jump shot, who picked you first for his team? The lines that war had drawn so sharply began to blur in ways none had anticipated, creating a strange new reality where captors and captives shared moments of genuine camaraderie on a wooden court in Kentucky. By early autumn, the Hungarian prisoners had developed genuine skill at the unfamiliar sport.
Weekly games had evolved from chaotic scrambles to reasonably organized matches with designated positions and basic strategies. Some men discovered natural talents. Istvan Nemeth, a former cavalry officer, proved remarkably adept at long-distance shooting, while Farron's height made him valuable under the basket. The Americans seemed genuinely impressed by their progress, offering coaching and encouragement rather than condescension. Most surprising was how quickly the game had become important to men who had initially viewed it with suspicion. They discussed strategies at meals, practiced shooting techniques during free time, even dreamed about making crucial baskets. "I never imagined caring about such a thing," admitted Sergeant Fairhair, a serious man who had fought through 3 years of brutal combat. "Back home, only football mattered. Now I find myself thinking about this basketball, even when I should be planning for after the war." His confession revealed something vital. The game had become more than recreation. It was a bridge to normalcy, a reminder that life contained more than survival and conflict. For men whose existence had narrowed to trenches and orders, to hunger and fear, the simple pleasure of physical competition offered something precious, a glimpse of what peace might feel like. The Americans' attitude during these games revealed cultural differences that went beyond sport. When a Hungarian player made a good move, guards would offer high fives or compliments. They played hard but kept score loosely, emphasizing enjoyment over victory. This casual approach to competition contradicted everything the prisoners had experienced in military training, where winning was paramount and failure brought shame. "They play like children," observed Lieutenant Nagy, not critically but with wonder. "They remember it is a game." This perspective, that competition could exist without life or death stakes, that play mattered for its own sake, represented a worldview many prisoners found both foreign and appealing. What none could have predicted was how basketball would create unexpected bonds across the barriers of language, culture, and wartime enmity. When Private Davis missed 3 weeks of games due to a family emergency, the Hungarian players asked after him with genuine concern. When Zoltan celebrated his 32nd birthday, the Americans brought a chocolate bar to court as a makeshift celebration. These small moments of human connection existed outside the framework of war, suggesting possibilities that propaganda on both sides had denied, that enemies could recognize each other's humanity, that shared experience could bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides. As autumn deepened toward winter, the gymnasium became more than a recreation space. It transformed into a neutral territory, where men defined by conflict could briefly exist as simply men, connected by nothing more complicated than a bouncing orange ball. The prison camp's records, meticulously maintained by American administrators, revealed the scope of the recreational program. Basketball was just one of several sports introduced to the approximately 3,000 foreign prisoners housed at Camp Breckenridge. The gymnasium hosted not only basketball, but volleyball, boxing instruction, and gymnastics. Outside, baseball diamonds and soccer fields accommodated other group activities. Records indicated that prisoners who participated in these programs showed fewer disciplinary problems, better physical health, and improved psychological outcomes, compared to those in camps with more restrictive policies. This wasn't mere kindness. It reflected a pragmatic approach to prisoner management. American military documents from the period revealed that recreation programs served multiple purposes: maintaining order, preventing the psychological deterioration that often accompanied captivity, demonstrating American values, and potentially influencing prisoners' post-war attitudes. Recreation officers received specific training in using sports as a tool for re-education, not through propaganda, but through experience. Let prisoners see American values in action, rather than lecture them about democracy, the thinking went. The scale of this effort impressed even skeptical prisoners. The camp contained not one, but 3 gymnasiums, each equipped with heating systems, electric lighting, and proper equipment. Supply officers allocated specific budgets for recreational materials, ensuring consistent availability of balls, nets, and other necessities. Even more striking was the staffing. Dedicated recreation officers held regular ranks within the military hierarchy, their work considered an official function rather than an afterthought.
This systematic approach revealed an America that organized its abundance with methodical precision, applying the same industrial efficiency to prisoner welfare that it did to manufacturing tanks or processing rations. From a Hungarian perspective, this organization seemed almost supernatural. Their own army had struggled to maintain basic supplies for fighting men. The notion of dedicating resources to prisoner recreation would have seemed absurd. Yet here was evidence that America's industrial capacity extended so far beyond the necessities that it could afford apparent luxuries even for enemies. Private Kovacs, who had worked in a factory before the war, marveled at the basketball's construction. Perfectly round, evenly textured, consistently bouncy. Even our boots weren't made with such care, he noted during one practice session. These people make toys better than we make weapons. Statistics reinforced this impression. By 1944, American factories produced more than 15 million sporting goods items annually, even with wartime restrictions. The country maintained nearly 20,000 basketball courts in public schools alone. Even accounting for propaganda exaggeration, these numbers suggested a nation whose productive capacity dwarfed anything the Axis powers could mobilize. For prisoners who had witnessed shortages of everything from ammunition to medical supplies, the implication was clear. If America could spare resources for games while fighting a global war, how could countries like Hungary have hoped to prevail? The medical aspects of the recreation program revealed another dimension of American approaches.
Camp doctors actively encouraged participation, prescribing specific exercises for prisoners recovering from wounds or illness. Medical records documented improvements in cardiovascular health, reduced incidences of depression, and faster rehabilitation for injured men who engaged in regular physical activity. This integration of recreation into healthcare reflected a holistic approach far removed from the battlefield medicine many Hungarians had experienced. The message, never stated explicitly but clear nonetheless, was that even enemy bodies deserved maintenance and care, a concept that challenged fundamental assumptions about the worth assigned to opposition forces during wartime. The economic reality behind these programs became increasingly clear as prisoners observed camp operations. America's ability to maintain such facilities stemmed not just from wealth, but from systems designed for efficiency and scale.
Supplies arrived with metronomic regularity, distributed according to calculated needs rather than arbitrary decisions. The contrast with the increasingly chaotic supply situations prisoners had experienced in the Hungarian army was stark. There, officers had hoarded resources. Distribution followed hierarchies of favor rather than need, and shortages had been addressed with exhortations to sacrifice rather than increases in production. Here, abundance appeared systematic rather than exceptional, a product of organization rather than luck. This revelation carried implications far beyond basketball courts. It suggested fundamental differences in how societies could function, differences that would shape the post-war world in ways none could yet fully imagine. As winter approached and the Hungarian prisoners entered their 7th month of captivity, the basketball games revealed deeper transformations occurring beneath the surface. Men who had once viewed Americans with suspicion now argued good-naturedly about NBA teams they'd never seen play. Prisoners who had arrived silent and withdrawn now shouted encouragement from the sidelines. The gymnasium had become a space where small openings toward understanding could emerge, fragile but persistent. During one December game, Captain Reynolds brought a visitor, his 10-year-old son Michael, visiting during school holidays. The boy watched wide-eyed as prisoners and guards played together, occasionally clapping when either side scored. After the game, Michael approached Andras with the directness only children possess, asking through his father's translation, "Were you really our enemies? You don't seem like bad people." The question, innocent yet profound, struck Andras speechless. How could he explain to this child the complex political forces that had aligned Hungary with Germany? "We were soldiers," he finally answered, choosing words the boy might understand. "Sometimes soldiers fight because they're told to, not because they hate." Captain Reynolds translated, then added his own comment. "That's why we play basketball here, to remember we're all just people." The moment lingered, heavy with implications neither man could fully articulate. In that gymnasium, with its polished floors and echoing spaces, something had been constructed alongside basketball skills. A fragile recognition of shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries of conflict. For many prisoners, this recognition triggered profound identity crises. Men who had defined themselves as patriots, as defenders against American imperialism, now found themselves enjoying American games, appreciating American fairness, even developing friendships with American guards. Sergeant Fairhair, who had once lectured younger soldiers on the decadence of Western democracies, now spent hours practicing his free throws. Lieutenant Sabo, who had joined the Aerocross party before the war, found himself discussing fishing spots with a guard from Minnesota, discovering shared interests that transcended politics. These connections created cognitive dissonance. How could these Americans be the enemy when they showed such humanity? If the propaganda had been wrong about this, what else had it distorted? Private Lakatos expressed this confusion during an evening conversation in the barracks. "I fought because I was told America wanted to destroy our way of life," he said quietly.
But these men, they teach us their games. They share their magazines. They treat our injuries. They seem to want us to understand them, not fear them. Others nodded, recognizing the paradox. The enemy they had been trained to hate had revealed itself to be recognizably human, capable of fairness and even kindness. This realization didn't erase political differences or excuse wartime actions on either side, but it complicated the neat categories that war required. How could you maintain pure hatred for men who picked you for their basketball team, who remembered your hometown, who shared chocolate from care packages? The consequences extended beyond personal confusion into deeper questions about systems and societies. If America could afford to treat prisoners with such humanity, what did this reveal about comparative standards of living? If American guards approached recreation with such enthusiasm, what did this suggest about quality of life for ordinary citizens?
Basketball became not just a game, but a window into a society organized around principles many had never experienced. Abundance rather than scarcity, opportunity rather than restriction, individuality within collective endeavor. These observations, accumulated through months of games and interactions, created a subtle but profound re-education, more effective than any propaganda film or lecture. By Christmas 1944, something remarkable had developed on the basketball court. Genuine competition balanced with respect. The weekly games had evolved into highly anticipated matches with shifting team compositions and good-natured rivalries. Guards and prisoners alike discussed strategies and celebrated skilled plays, regardless of who executed them. The court had become neutral territory where skill mattered more than status, where the artificial hierarchy of captor and captive temporarily dissolved into the simpler division of teammates versus opponents. This transformation represented something profound, not an erasure of the conflict that had brought them together, but a glimpse of what might exist beyond it. On a snow-dusted morning just after New Year's, news reached the camp that would change everything. Hungary had officially surrendered to Soviet forces, switching sides in the conflict. The prisoners gathered in stunned silence as Captain Reynolds read the announcement. Their country was now technically allied with America against Germany. This political reversal transformed their status overnight. No longer enemies, but not quite allies, caught in a diplomatic limbo that mirrored their psychological state. For men who had already begun questioning their place in the conflict, this official reversal merely confirmed what basketball had been teaching them for months, that the lines dividing humanity were more permeable than they had been led to believe. The final game took place a week before repatriation began. The gymnasium buzzed with an energy both celebratory and melancholy. Men who had entered as enemies would leave as something undefined but fundamentally changed. The game itself became almost symbolic, played with intensity but without animosity, competitive yet collaborative. When the final whistle blew, players who had once stood on opposite sides of a global conflict lined up to shake hands. No photographers documented this moment. No propaganda officers framed it for public consumption. It was simply men acknowledging a shared experience that had, against all odds, created connections where only division had been expected. As they filed out of the gymnasium for the last time, Andras paused to look back at the court where so much had transpired. Captain Reynolds stood beside him, both men momentarily silent before the officer spoke. "You know, when they assigned me to this camp, I wasn't sure what to expect. We were told you were the enemy." He hesitated, searching for words.
"I guess what I learned is that enemies are created by governments, not by people." Andras nodded, understanding flowing beneath the language barrier. The basketball court had taught this lesson more effectively than any speech or declaration could have. That humanity persists beneath the artificial categories of conflict, waiting to be rediscovered in something as simple as a game. Years later, when Andras returned to a Hungary transformed by Soviet occupation, he carried memories that would shape his understanding of the post-war world. The abundance of American basketballs existed alongside the reality of segregation and inequality he had glimpsed in newspapers. The kindness of Kentucky guards didn't erase the destruction American bombers had brought to European cities. The complexity resisted easy categorization, just as the prisoners and guards had defied the simple labels of enemy and captor. What remained clearest in his memory wasn't political revelation, but human connection. The simple fact that men divided by war had found common ground on a wooden court, passing a ball back and forth across boundaries that had once seemed impermeable. The basketball itself became a symbol of this complexity. Andras had been allowed to keep one as a souvenir, a gesture of surprising generosity from Captain Reynolds. Back in Budapest, where Soviet tanks now patrolled streets and new propaganda replaced old, the ball sat in his apartment as a private reminder. When neighbors or officials visited, he kept it hidden, knowing its American origin would raise uncomfortable questions. But on quiet evenings, he would sometimes take it out, feeling its textured surface, remembering the sound it made against the polished gymnasium floor. The ball represented neither American superiority nor a Hungarian defeat, but something more nuanced. A reminder that beneath the grand narratives of history, individual humans find ways to recognize each other's humanity, even across the divide of conflict. Perhaps this is the lesson worth carrying forward from those unexpected games in Kentucky. Not that war can be reduced to sport, or that recreation erases real grievances, but that moments of connection remain possible even in the most divided times. Across gyms and fields, across borders and ideologies, the simple act of play continues to create spaces where people might see beyond the categories that separate them. In this possibility lies not a solution to the world's conflicts, but a reminder worth preserving, that beneath the artificial boundaries we construct, shared humanity waits to be rediscovered, one bounce, one pass, one game at a time.